It's time to start. Dear colleagues and audience, welcome to attend Professor Timothy Williamson's first lecture at Wuhan University in the lecture series on logic and philosophy. Timothy Williamson is a Wickham Professor of Logic at Oxford University. He holds several academic titles. From Wikipedia, in his book, Knowledge and Its Limits, he argues that the concept of knowledge cannot be analyzed into a set of other concepts. The knowledge requires justification, truth, and belief. The word knowledge cannot be accurately regarded as simply shorthand for justified true belief. It initiated a whole new approach to epistemology, generally referred to as knowledge-first epistemology. In this lecture, he will talk about his general knowledge-first approach to epistemology, especially as developed in his book, Knowledge and Its Limits, and subsequent articles. During the lecture, the audience can write down your questions in the chat box. The staff at Yuexue Shuzhi will forward your question to us. At the end of his lecture, Professor Timothy Williamson will give his replies. Also, today we have interlocutor, Associate Professor Ye Ru from Wuhan University. After the main lecture from Professor Williamson, she will give comment or question for Williamson's lecture, and Williamson will give replies. Okay, now let's welcome Professor Timothy Williamson and give his first lecture, Knowledge is the First, please.
Right, thank you. So first I need to share my screen. Good. And now okay, so thank you. So I'm going to be talking today about the knowledge first approach to epistemology and how I came to develop that, which will also show something about the motivations for the view. So that's the approach to epistemology in Knowledge and Its Limits in 2000, and something also about its more immediate historical antecedents, not so much about its more distant way in which I think it also relates to the thinking about in the more general history of philosophy. So in lecture 2, I showed how analyzing indiscriminability in terms of knowledge enables us to understand its logic, which I did in my first book, Identity and Discrimination, and why there were specific features of the logic of indiscriminability which really required one to think in terms of something like knowledge rather than something like belief or justified belief. And since discrimination is very widely regarded as a basic feature of cognition, I mean, that was a hint to me that knowledge too is basic to cognition, that even when we're dealing with the most fundamental aspects of cognition, the ones that human beings share with many other animals, thinking in terms of knowledge rather than belief is the right starting point. Although, of course, it was only one particular point, but it was a hint of something more general. And I'll just tell you an anecdote, which is not of great significance in itself, except that it was a moment when, as it were, I somehow became aware that this was a significant issue, and where I as it were, I could see where my own thoughts were leading. So this was at a conference in 1990, actually a conference to celebrate 50 years of the journal Analysis. So I was in the audience for a talk by the Canadian philosopher Jonathan Bennett, which was about the difficulty of explaining why it is normally impossible to believe something by an act of will. Sorry, is he Canadian? Sorry, that might be wrong. But anyway, he's the philosopher, well-known philosopher Jonathan Bennett. So he was interested in the question of why you can't just decide to believe something, to as it were, pick up a proposition and simply think I'm going to believe that, and then as a result of the immediate result of that, just believe it. So in the discussion after his talk, I casually suggested that one might start with the impossibility of knowing something by an act of will. You can't simply just decide to take a random proposition and decide I'm going to know that proposition, because after all, it might not even be true. And you can't decide that by an act of will. And so I suggested that one might start with the impossibility of knowing something by an act of will and then derive the corresponding feature of belief through a connection between knowledge and belief. This was, at the time, this felt like just a very casual suggestion. There was a sort of gap where nobody had a question, and this was a kind of thought that came to me. It might be worth exploring. And I was a bit surprised by Bennett's response, which was that he said, I've been philosophizing for 30 years without using the concept of knowledge, and I recommend that you do the same. And the thought just spontaneously came to me that that's where you make your big mistake. But actually, I very much appreciated the way that he was conscious about his own methodological preferences there, that he was specifically avoided using the concept of knowledge, not simply that it hadn't been one that he'd worked on, but that it was one that, as where he thought he clearly thought that philosophers should avoid, and that struck me as very revealing, and in fact as a symptom of a really quite deep mistake. So that was, as it were, for me, that was a kind of consciousness raising moment. Something else that influenced me, that I'd sort of been aware of for quite a long time, was that after Gettier refuted the justified true belief analysis of knowledge in his famous 1963 article, epistemology had got involved in a long series of attempts to analyze knowledge in terms of belief, truth, justification, causation, and people tried all sorts of other factors to fix the analysis of knowledge. But fundamentally, it was an analysis of knowledge in terms of belief and truth and other stuff. And these analyses, they became more and more complicated because so did the counterexamples that refuted them. I mean, as it were, for every analysis, there seemed to be or proposed analysis, there seemed to be a counterexample, and then for every counterexample, there seemed to be some kind of repair to get round it. But it did not seem to me that this was going in a fruitful direction. In the terms of the philosopher of science, Imre Lakatos, this looked like a degenerating research program to me. So that was something before, as it were, I'd been particularly thinking about working in epistemology. That was an indication of something going wrong in epistemology that there was so much focus on what looked so unpromising a direction of thought. And I think many philosophers, I mean, analytic philosophers, but ones who were not themselves involved in epistemology, had a similar kind of skepticism about this post-Gettier research program for the analysis of knowledge. And one particular consideration was it was not really credible that when we use the ordinary word "no," which it's one of the 10 most commonly used verbs in the English language, that we meant anything so complicated as these extraordinarily convoluted proposed analyses. I mean, it seemed that these were not things that normal speakers were even capable of meaning by the word knowledge. Even if they got the extension right, they didn't correspond to the way that ordinary speakers actually grasped what knowledge was. And just on general grounds, as it were, more in the philosophy of mind or in cognitive science than in epistemology, it just seemed more plausible that the meaning of the word "no" was something, as it were, cognitively quite simple, and that we did not or understand it by means of any analysis in terms of belief. So that was one thing that had been in my thinking for a long time, and I think in the thinking of many philosophers, and that to me was a hint that that knowledge should be taken as basic. I mean, I think many philosophers who noticed that this program of trying to analyze it in terms of belief and other things, they drew a different moral. That there was something almost pathological about the term knowledge, and therefore it should not be used in epistemology. But that didn't seem such a plausible diagnosis of what was going wrong, because the fact that it's in such incredibly common use in ordinary speech suggested that it was in fact marking some quite significant distinction. That if it's marking a distinction that it's often very useful for people to make, it's not likely that it corresponds to some kind of bizarre, complicated definition. So that was one aspect of the way in which I was, as it were, even from the time I was a student, I was, as it were, potentially receptive to a knowledge-first approach. Something else I was interested in, but this is coming more towards around about 1990, that sort of time. I was also interested in the contrast, which is noted by Elizabeth Anscombe in her book Intention, between intentional states with what are called opposite directions of fit. So both belief and intention, they sort of in some sense, they aim at a match between mind and world. But while belief aims at fitting the mind to a given state of the world, intention aims at fitting the world to a given state. Sorry, there's a misprint on the slide here. It's intention aims at fitting the world to a given state of the mind. So, I mean, the difference here would be between the state of believing the door to be shut and the state of intending the door to be shut. So if the door isn't shut, then in terms of belief, that requires an adjustment of the belief. But in terms of intention, it requires an adjustment of the door. Anscombe actually has a nice example of the same kind of contrast in direction of fit, where someone is going shopping, and he's been given a shopping list by his wife. So she's given him a list of things that he must buy in the shop, but there's also a detective who is following this man round the shop and making a list of the things that he buys. So the shopping list given by the wife has one direction of fit. It corresponds to intention, whereas the shopping list compiled by the detective has the opposite direction of fit, but it corresponds to beliefs. So thinking in these ways, where everything goes well with intention, there is action. For example, intentionally shutting the door, to go back to that example. And where all goes well with belief, there is knowledge. For example, knowing that the door is shut. So knowledge stands to one direction of fit, as action stands to the other direction of fit. And when I say action, I mean intentional action, not just any kind of random change or physical change. So that was another line of thought which suggested that as whether there was something important about knowledge, because I mean, clearly action is central to intelligent life. I mean, the point of as it were being intelligent for any species of animal is presumably, to so that you can act in ways which are beneficial to you, and that you can adjust your action to the state of the environment, which is, of course, a very complicated and changing matter. But this analogy suggests that knowledge should also be central to intelligent life, because, as it were, in some, roughly speaking, action and knowledge are a kind of symmetrical pair. They just, the states that I mean, or the mental features that correspond to opposite directions of fit, and each corresponds to the case where things go well. Everything goes as it should. So it actually took me many years to make the analogy work smoothly. For example, to find the right place in the analogy for desire. I won't go into the details of that, but it's something on which I have actually changed. I changed my mind after writing Knowledge and Its Limits. But I was always convinced that this analogy was basically sound, and it gave me confidence that a knowledge-centered approach was on the right track. Because, I mean, if you think of as well, epistemology which marginalizes knowledge, that would correspond by this analogy to somebody doing the theory of doing the philosophy of action while marginalizing the category of action. And that seems crazy, and not simply because we call it the philosophy of action. After all, we call epistemology the philosophy of theory of knowledge. But it's also that, as it were, if you try to focus just on intention without being interested in action, you seem to be missing the point. Intention and trying are aimed at action. And then, of course, the analogy would suggest that in some way, belief aims at knowledge. So that, as it were, my confidence that there was fundamentally an important insight in this kind of contrast of direction of fit. That gave me confidence that a knowledge-centered approach was on the right track. Now, so those are some comments on, as it were, the various kind of lines of thought, converging lines of thought that I'd been following, but in the period before I started working on the knowledge first approach. But I now want to as it were, step back and also make some comments on the historical context of my development of the knowledge first approach. I mean, I should say that if one looks as it were in a wider context, I think the attempt to analyze knowledge in terms of belief it is, although one can find it, for example, in Plato, at least some attempts along those lines. Not clear whether Plato thinks that's the right way to go. That has not been, in the history of philosophy, the main way in which knowledge has been understood, although, of course, it was the main way in which it was understood in analytic epistemology from roughly the Second World War on. But I want to focus on less distant history of philosophy. So, in fact, we can find that in a not very well-known philosophical tradition, which we can call Oxford realism. So, a knowledge-first approach to the mind goes back several generations in the tradition of, sorry, that should just be Oxford realism, which is associated with now a semi-forgotten figure, John Cook Wilson, who was Wickham Professor of Logic at Oxford from 1889 to 1915. And in that period, he was the dominant figure in Oxford philosophy. So that's actually the same chair that I now have. So I think now the idealist F.H. Bradley, who wrote, for example, Appearance and Reality and Ethical Studies, he's now a better known Oxford philosopher of that period than Cook Wilson. But Bradley was a recluse who had little personal contact with other philosophers. He was in that respect, he was a kind of loner, and so he was actually in that period. He was much less influential in Oxford than Cook Wilson. Now, going back to Cook Wilson, in his posthumous work, Statement and Inference, which came out in 1926 or 27, Cook Wilson wrote of the different forms of thinking. What does unify them is the fact that the one, thinking, which is not knowing, entirely depends on the other, knowing, and is only intelligible through it. So what he's saying in that quotation is that the unifying factor in all sorts of different kinds of thinking is their relation to knowing. So that's a very strong statement of the centrality of knowing to mind, that although not all thinking is knowing, but the thinking, as it were, the only way to understand all these other forms of thinking, according to Cook Wilson, is in terms of their relation to knowing. And of course, not surprisingly, given this view, Cook Wilson also denied that knowing can be defined in more basic terms, because he thought that knowing was itself the most basic thing, and that if you tried to define knowing in terms of thinking, that was just the wrong direction, because all these other forms of thinking had to be understood in terms of knowing. So it was going in the wrong direction of analysis. So Cook-Wilson's pupil, H.A. Pritchard, he inherited his realist approach. And he later became professor of moral philosophy at Oxford. And he's actually still quite well known amongst people who do meta-ethics, because he was one of the people who advocated something like an intuitional approach to moral epistemology. And I mean, Pritchard, although his works are not so influential now, but he taught both J.L. Austin, the Oxford so-called ordinary language philosopher, and also Wilfrid Sellars, who's American but who spent some time in Oxford in the 1930s, and both Austin and Sellars, of course, became very influential much later in the 1950s, and they both show signs of the influence of Pritchard and through Pritchard of Cook-Wilson. So, I mean, in particular, when they talk about perceptual appearances, they both give priority to veridical perception. So as it were, in both cases, they want to understand illusions and hallucinations as in some way deviations from the case of perception where everything goes well, and for example, you know, they would insist that we have to understand the idea of how things seem in terms of the idea of how things are. For example, that you know, as it were, we understand what it is to look square in terms of what it is to be square, not the other way round. And I think, as it were, maybe distantly, but Cook-Wilson's prioritization of knowing over other forms of thinking is there in behind those kind of emphases, even if Austin and Sellars were not directly so interested in Cook-Wilson. And those ideas, but specifically those ideas about perception, they fed into what are known as disjunctivist accounts of perception, which are associated with more recent Oxford philosophers such as J.M. Hinton, John McDowell, Paul Snowden, and now in Oxford today, my colleague Michael Martin. And so these disjunctivist accounts involve a sort of direct realism. So these are people who published in the 1960s, 70s, and on until now. But they're in the same tradition of Oxford realism, and disjunctivism about perception it's similar in spirit to a knowledge-first approach to epistemology. But the knowledge-first approach to epistemology was not really salient in Oxford philosophy in the second half of the 20th century, though there are actually signs of it in McDowell's work. So that's as it were, one way in which the tradition from Cook-Wilson, up to the present day, it was never completely broken, even though it was, somewhat obscured. And as I say, for a long period, the only signs of it were in the theory of perception, not other aspects of epistemology. But so in relation to my own experience of this, as an undergraduate, I read an excerpt from Cook Wilson's book. It was in a little collection of readings, which was kind of standard for undergraduates to use. And in that short excerpt, he articulates his knowledge first approach. I mean, that quotation that I gave you before about knowing being what unifies other forms of thinking, it comes from that excerpt. So I had read it as an undergraduate, but actually at the time I was not convinced. But I mean, Cook Wilson was a rather dogmatic writer who didn't provide much argument for his position to persuade other people. And actually, as I learned more about him, I found some of his philosophical attitudes very unattractive. So, he wasn't somebody that I ever identified with philosophically. So one thing that comes out, actually not in the part that I'd read, but in the rest of Cook Wilson's discussion, and which Pritchard inherited from him, is that Cook Wilson seems to have thought that one's always in a position to recognize whether one is in a state of knowing or not. And in particular, he definitely thought that if you know something, then you fundamentally know that you know it, which is a view that I spent a lot of time criticizing. But I mean, a general view that not particularly in the form that he held it, and it's still a view that is held by some epistemologists, such as, for example, Robert Stallmaker and some of his students. But this idea that you can always recognize whether you're in a state of knowing or not, I mean, that just doesn't seem to work when one's in a skeptical scenario, because they're just, for all you can tell, you know that you have hands, for example, if you're a brain in a vat, but nevertheless, you don't know that you have hands because you don't have hands. So that aspect of Cook Wilson's epistemology was very problematic. And another unattractive feature of Cook Wilson was that he was a violent opponent of developments such as non-Euclidean geometry, which of course was starting to play an absolute, was well established as a branch of mathematics by his time, and through the work of Einstein was starting to play a central role in physics as well. And he was also a violent opponent of the beginnings of modern logic. Really, modern logic wasn't represented in Oxford at his time at all. It wasn't really until after the Second World War. But there was the Charles Ludwig Dodgson, who's in fact, he's better known under his pseudonym of Lewis Carroll, who wrote Alice in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass, but he was also quite a creative logician, still more in an older tradition, but he was actually, he was open to new developments. And in fact, a short article that he published in Mind called Achilles and the Tortoise, I mean, that's still treated as a classic in really in metalogic. I mean, it's about the way in which we can't, well, one interpretation of it anyway is that the way that we can't reduce rules of inference to axioms. I mean, it's a very seminal piece with a lot which can be interpreted in very many different ways, but I think people in the area generally feel that there is some important insight, maybe more than one insight in it. And so Lewis Carroll was really an important figure in logic at that time, and particularly, as it were, philosophical logic. But Cook-Wilson was completely dismissive of him. They had a lot of correspondence, and Cook-Wilson was just a sort of conservative defender of something much more like traditional logic. So those were features of Cook-Wilson that were not attractive to me. And so I did not trust his intellectual judgment and was not directly influenced by him. But and also as a student, I was aware of disjunctivism because that was a view that John McDowell and Paul Snowden, who were teaching in Oxford at the time, followed. But its kind of disjunctive form seemed inelegant and unattractive to me. So it's disjunctive in the sense that it treated veridical perception and illusions and so on as sort of two separate ways in which something could appear to be the case. So that, you know, if something, roughly speaking, if something looks red, that could either be because you can see that it's red, or because there's some kind of illusion or hallucination of it being red. Well, illusion. And as we're just treating these as separate, mutually irreducible ways in which something could be read, that seemed to me, and not the right way of understanding what was going on. I mean, a better way of understanding it is really the way in which you simply understand looking directly in terms of the good case, where you could actually see what color something is, and then all the cases where you can something looks red, which you can't distinguish from cases where you could actually see that it's red. That those are, as it were, the kind of secondary cases. So some kind of analog, in fact, of the Cook-Wilson idea that all the other forms of thinking are unified by their relation to knowing. You can have a similar view of what's going on in perception, but that's not exactly a disjunctive view because you're not treating the disjuncts as separate. So that disjunctivism, the way it was set up, was not a direct influence on me either. Didn't like that kind of structure of that approach. So although I was not drawn to the specific forms of Oxford realism available to me, in a more general way, I found the tradition of prioritizing reality over appearance epistemologically increasingly attractive. That seemed like the right way to understand things. Maybe not right from the start, but increasingly I was warming to that general approach, even though I didn't like the specific ways in which it was implemented in the disjunctive accounts of perception. But by contrast, Michael Dummett's anti-realism, with its rejection of classical logic and its scientifically dubious emphasis on behavioral criteria for mental states, was totally alien to me. So I definitely wanted some kind of realist approach to epistemology, because the costs of an anti-realist approach, it seemed far too high, and the rewards are far too low. So, as well, this is just to say a little bit more about why I didn't like Dummett's anti-realist approach. I mean, his anti-realist semantics replaced truth conditions by assertability conditions, but our attempts to articulate these assertability conditions for empirical statements made very little progress because they couldn't handle the holistic character of verification. So such statements are not associated with theory neutral verification conditions. That's a rather abstract kind of way of putting things, but really what Dummett wanted to do in replacing assertability instead of truth in semantics was to associate each sentence with a special assertability condition. So there'll be an assertability condition for that's arsenic, or that's water or whatever. And it seemed to me that those attempts to state sort of distinctive assertability conditions didn't really work because they never took proper account of the role of sort of background knowledge, and so verification in general is too complex a matter to have the sort of compositional quality of systematic semantics, and so if the verification conditions depends on theories, then they're not simply built into the meaning of these expressions, many of which we use without relying on a particular theory, or different people may use different theories. So by around 1994, it was becoming clear to me that the epistemological condition for asserting that P was simply knowing that P by whatever means. And this was a view that I defended in my paper, Knowing and Asserting, which came out in the Philosophical Review in 1996. So this was, as it were, a much more realist approach to the conditions for assertion than the kind of anti-realist approach that Dummett was assuming. If you think of the assertability as just knowledge, then for various reasons you simply can't give a systematic semantics. For example, you can't explain what it is to know whether P or Q in terms of what it is to know P and to know Q. For example, you can know that somebody is either in the house or in the garden without knowing that they're in the house and without knowing that they're in the garden. So I was following a more realist approach to assertion, which doesn't fit the assertability conditional semantics that anti-realism of Dummett's type wanted to give. And so this was, for me, this was another indication of the epistemological centrality of knowledge, that it was the notion of knowledge that was needed for understanding assertion, not some notion of belief or justification or truth. People have tried to understand assertion in those terms, but I think one can show that those attempts are all defective. So that a very simple connection between assertion and knowledge is really the right way to understand what is required normatively to make an assertion. So what I'm doing here, by the way, is I'm giving you a whole lot of different lines of thought, which were all converging on the centrality of knowledge. That it seemed to me that they were all pointing towards the same thing. So a completely different line of thought, and part of the historical context that I was working in was that another part of it was that the knowledge first approach was in effect a development of externalism in the philosophy of mind. So let me explain what I mean by externalism in philosophy of mind. So a state, for example, a state is internal. It's just a definition. If and only if whether you are in in that state S is determined purely by what is going on inside you. I mean, of course, there are different ways of understanding inside here. We could understand it physically, just physically, of terms of physical events inside one's body or inside one's brain, or you could also understand it in a more subjective, phenomenological way. For present purposes, we don't need to decide between these two ways of understanding it. We could just be neutral on that here. But I think just as you just have some kind of intuitive notion of what's going on inside a person, then internal states are ones where whether you're in those states just depends on what's going on inside you. So internalism in the philosophy of mind says that all genuine mental states are internal, whereas externalism says that some genuine mental states are not internal. So in effect, internalism and externalism are simply the negations of each other. So let's just consider the state of knowing that it's raining. Since only what is true is known, one knows that it's raining only if it is raining. So let's compare you when you know that it's raining with twin you, who's in a skeptical scenario where it's not raining. But of course, it appears to twin you that it's raining, but in fact it's not. So what is going on inside twin you is just like what is going on inside you when you know that it's raining. But twin you does not know that it's raining because it isn't raining in twin you's world or environment. And so that shows that knowing that it's raining is not an internal state, because you can have two subjects who are in exactly the same state internally. What's going on inside them is exactly the same, but one of them knows that it's raining and the other does not. And that's because of the way they're hooked up differently to their environment. So knowing that it's raining is not an internal state. And so for internalists who think that all genuine mental states are internal, that shows that knowing that it's raining is not a genuine mental state. For internalists, knowing that it's raining is more like a combination of some internal state plus some causal connections between that internal state and the external environment. Whereas if you think about believing that it's raining, that seems to be an internal state. So at least when you first think about it, it seems that what's involved in believing that it's raining is just depends on what's going on inside you. Because and both you who know that it's raining and twin you who is deceived into falsely believing that it's raining, what you both share is that you both believe that it's raining, because knowledge implies belief. And so for internalists, believing that it's raining may be a genuine mental state. And I think, this is one reason why so many people were inclined to think that believing maybe it's more basic, even in epistemology, than knowing, and they thought that because they thought of believing as a pure mental state, whereas they thought of knowing as some kind of mixture of mental states and other things, such as facts in the environment. So for internalists, as I've said, this suggests that belief states are more basic than knowledge states, that the knowledge states are hybrids of genuine mental states and other factors, for example, states of the weather. But so that was, as it were, that's why internalism in the philosophy of mind seemed to go with, as it were, a preference for belief first rather than knowledge first approaches to epistemology. But the developments in the philosophy of mind in the 1970s indicated that not even belief states are internal. So the crucial work here was done particularly by Hilary Putnam with a classic article in 1973 and Meaning and Reference, and Tyler Burge with a classic article in 1979, Individualism and the Mental. And they made a strong case for externalism about the contents of propositional attitudes, such as belief. So this is Putnam's case. Whether you're in the state of believing that water is wet depends on whether the liquid you have been interacting with in your environment is H2O or XYZ, not just on what is going on inside you. I mean, actually, in Putnam's original article, he was more focused on linguistic meaning than on the content of psychological states, of mental states. But Tyler Burge extended the argument to mental states themselves, and I think Hilary Putnam then later accepted that extension, so that although this kind of externalism applies to linguistic meaning as well, as where maybe the most fundamental form of it applies at the level of thought. So this was Hilary Putnam's famous thought experiment, where he imagined another planet where instead of water, they have, instead of H2O, they have a different liquid XYZ, which is kind of superficially similar to water in observable ways. It looks and smells and tastes just like water, but it's actually completely different chemically. And so the people in that world, they, when they see something that looks in a way whose observable properties are just like those of water, they're not actually believing that it's water, because if they were believing that, they would be wrong, because it's not water. It's not H2O at all. But they're not wrong. They have a different belief, which is true, but where it's part of what they believe. I mean, we're talking about people here who, before the chemistry of water or the corresponding liquid on Twin Earth was actually understood. So they just think of both of these just as water, understood in a more ordinary pre-scientific way. And what's going on inside them is exactly the same. But in one case, they have a belief about water, and in the other case, they don't have a belief about water. They have a belief about the liquid that is present in their environment. And so that shows that even something like believing that water is wet, beliefs about water, they are not purely internal states, because the internal state doesn't determine whether your belief is about water or about some other liquid that has, as it were, superficially similar properties. And then in Burge's case, he was more interested in the kind of externalism that comes from our thoughts being in a public language, in a shared language. So whether you're in the state of believing that you have arthritis in your thigh depends on how the word arthritis is used in your community. This is Burge's example in the 1979 paper, not just on what's going on inside you. So, when we have people who are not medical experts, when they think things like, "Oh, I've got arthritis in my thigh," whether they're thinking, whether their thought is true or false, doesn't just depend on what's going on inside them. It also depends on how the word arthritis is used in the language community to which they belong, because that's what determines the reference of arthritis, even in someone's thought. So, in my community, you can't. I mean, if my community, if you believe that you have arthritis in your thigh, that belief is false, because arthritis it is a disease of the condition of the joints, and so you can't have it in your thigh. But there could be some other people where the term arthritis is used in a much more liberal way, so that it includes conditions of your thigh. And then in that community, somebody might, as it were, think to themselves, putting it in words, but I have arthritis in my thigh, and they might be thinking a true thought, because the reference of arthritis, as they use it, even in thought, is determined by a different linguistic practice. So these are cases which show that that having a specific belief is not a purely internal state, because it partly depends on your natural and social environment. So, and that might even apply to the example I gave before, believing that it's raining, because the reference of it's raining, when you think to yourself, "Oh, it's raining," that may itself be determined by the way in which the word raining is used in your community. For example, might determine whether if just a few drops of water are falling, that counts as raining or not. So even the states of belief, which looked internal, once you look carefully at what's going on with their content, you see that they're not, in fact, really internal, and therefore that they wouldn't satisfy the internalist constraint on genuine mental states. So, this is just summarizing the argument that believing that water is wet and believing that you have arthritis in your thigh, those are not internal states, rather surprisingly, but when you think it through, you realize that they're not internal states. And so what I was doing, in response to this, I think fairly widely accepted case for externalism about the contents of propositional attitudes. I mean, it was widely accepted at Oxford when I was a student there, and in fact, Gareth Evans and John McDowell, who are very influential philosophers of the younger generation teaching at Oxford, they were arguing for their own version of content externalism, particularly with reference to perceptual beliefs, such as that's a little, let's say, the belief that that's a little green man, that whether when one says that to oneself, whether one's actually articulating a genuine content or not may depend on whether the perceptual demonstrative that in fact refers to anything or not. So that was, through the 80s, this became, very much the dominant position in analytic philosophy, although there were certainly people who opposed it. But But I took myself to be extending externalism about propositional attitudes from their contents to the attitudes themselves. So I defended the idea that states of knowing are genuine mental states. So, with propositional attitudes, there seem to be, as it were, two dimensions to them. You can, for example, hoping and believing. If you hope that the sun will shine and you believe that the sun will shine, those have the same content but different attitudes. You can also have the same attitude and different contents, like hoping that the sun will shine versus hoping that it will rain. And so as were the externalism associated with Putnam and Burge was externalism about the contents of the attitudes, but I wanted to be externalist about the attitudes to those contents, to, as it were, the other dimension of variation in propositional attitudes. And so one can respond in analogous ways to internalist objections, for example, about the role of mental states in explaining actions, to externalism about attitudes as to externalism about contents. So, there were all sorts of debates about whether genuine mental states could be external or not. So, as there were debates between internalism and externalism. And the dialectic in those debates, could be mapped very easily onto the dialectic about debates concerning the kind of view that I wanted to defend, where the externalism was coming from the attitude rather than from the content. But for example, when you talk about where the kind of issues that were at stake in these debates, they had to do with things like the role of mental states in explaining actions. For example, internalists tried to argue that that only internal states, could properly explain actions, and then externalists had responses to those, and that kind of dialectic, which originally, as well, was played out in relation to externalism about content, you could play out exactly the same dialectic in relation to externalism about the attitudes themselves. And since, as it were, the kind of dominant, though not universal view, was that the externalism was kind of okay in that dialectic, that it would not get defeated by internalism with respect to content, then it was plausible that the dialectic would have the same outcome in relation to externalism about the attitudes which I was defending, as we're focusing on, for example, knowledge and seeing and other factive attitudes, other truth-entailing attitudes, whereas originally the dialectic was about the content. So as I say, just to summarize that, this helped me dialectically because externalism about contents was already widely, though not universally, accepted. And so, one way of thinking of this was that the knowledge-first approach in the philosophy of mind can be understood as a second wave of externalism, completing the externalist revolution. That, as it were, the kind of halfway house where people were externalists about content but internalists about attitudes, that struck me as unstable, and that if I was going to be an externalist, the natural thing was to be an externalist about both content and attitude. So one thing that but it's kind of interesting in relation to this, but that happened quite a bit later than the publication of Knowledge and Its Limits, was that the Canadian philosopher Jennifer Nagel showed that psychologists treat knowing as just as much a mental state as believing in their treatment of the human mind-reading capacity. So the mind-reading capacity is just our ability to, as well, our kind of ordinary natural ability to identify what mental states other people are in. And so that's something which psychologists study, and psychologists treat, identifying knowledge in and other people as, just another case of mind reading. They don't treat it as radically different in kind. So that was kind of support. Sorry, I'll just say a little bit more about that. For the view that I was taking. And I mean, you might think that it must be much harder for us to identify knowing than to identify believing. But when you think about it from a cognitive point of view, you realize that in fact that is not the case. That it's often easier to identify whether another human being knows something than to identify whether they believe it, because knowing is closely connected with things like perception. I mean, that's, seeing something is the case, is something that, that's a form of knowing that it's the case, and it's relatively easy to see what other people can see, because you can see which direction they're looking in. You can see what obstacles there are. These are all external things which you can see as an observer. You can see what the limits on someone's sight lines are, and then of course knowing goes well beyond seeing, because when you look in another direction, you stop seeing things, but you don't stop knowing those things. You still remember them. But those kind of external constraints on knowing actually make knowing much easier to identify than believing in another person. So that in a way, knowing is a more basic case than believing for a mind reading capacity. So it doesn't work the way that you might think it does. And in fact, in children, it seems that the ability to understand whether other people know things seems to come earlier than the ability to understand whether other people believe things. So I want to say now a little bit about the kind of view that I was defending in Knowledge and Its Limits about the relation between knowledge and belief. So I was arguing not just against interpreting knowledge as belief plus, that's a kind of post-Gettier sort of tradition, but for interpreting belief as knowledge minus. So in other words, whereas the belief-first approach tries to analyze knowledge or understand what knowledge is by adding things to belief, the knowledge-first approach tries to understand belief by subtracting things from knowledge, and or if you like, understanding belief as something that is similar to knowledge, but lacks some of what's needed for knowledge. So if you remember the analogy between knowledge and action that I was talking about earlier, in terms of direction of fit, this is similar to arguing not just against interpreting action as trying plus, but for interpreting trying as action minus. I put trying here, but you could also think of this in relation to intention, which is, if you like, is a kind of even a preliminary to trying. That as well, we understand, just as we might understand the states of intending and trying in relation to the successful state of doing, So we might understand these states of believing in relation to the successful state of knowing. So in both cases, the strategy is to give priority to the good case where everything functions well, and to understand other cases as deviations from the good case. So the good case would be, for example, the case, well, just to take a very ordinary example, the good case is the case for an action is the case where you intentionally shut the door. And then the bad cases would be cases where you intend or try to shut the door, but you fail. And similarly, in the epistemological case, the good case is a case where you know that the door is shut, and the bad cases are cases where it might seem to you that you know that the door is shut. You might believe that the door is shut, but in fact it's not shut. So if we think this way, that we're thinking of knowledge as a kind of functional norm for belief as well as for assertion. So there's something, the idea, roughly speaking, is that any belief which does not constitute knowledge is defective in this functional sense, a sense which is, in some way rooted in biology, because the big picture is that intelligent life is a matter of acting on what you know, and then acting on what you believe is a kind of defective case in relation to that. And of course, acting on what you believe but don't know is less likely to get you what you need than acting on what you know. So yet another way in which I wanted to make knowledge central to epistemology is that I argue that identifying one's total evidence for assessing hypotheses with one's total knowledge. So, as it were, if you know something, then that something is part of your evidence. You can properly use it as evidence. And if you don't know something, then you can't use it as evidence. And so in the more sort of theoretical sphere where we're assessing things on the basis of evidence, I argued that the relevant notion of evidence is simply what you know. Of course, you might think that something is part of your evidence when it isn't, but that's just a matter of human fallibility. So all these examples show that really that knowledge is treated as kind of the central norm for cognition on this approach. And as I've hinted, I think that that's in some way that there's something biologically natural for that, and that kind of biological approach to knowledge has been followed, for example, by Hilary Cornblyth. So what I want to discuss briefly, or kind of objection that some philosophers make to this, they've objected that knowledge is unsuited for this normative role because we're sometimes unable to recognize the limits of our knowledge. For example, in skeptical scenarios where we think we know a lot of things, and in fact, for all we can tell, we do know them, but we don't really know them. And thus we are sometimes unable to recognize whether we're violating knowledge norms. And so they thought there's something wrong about that kind of normative understanding, because they assume that epistemic norms must be transparent in the sense that we must always be able to recognize whether we are violating these norms. So their idea is something can only be a genuine norm if the agent is always at least in a position to recognize whether they're complying with it or violating it. But if you think about other norms, many of them are not transparent. So, for example, legal norms and norms of promise keeping. So for example, if there's a legal norm about, let's say, there's some rule about there's some taking someone else's, some law about taking someone else's property, then you may be breaking the law, but you may not know that you're breaking the law because the object in question is one that, let's say it's a book. It looks just like the book that your own copy of the book, and so you're not in a position to know that you're breaking the law, but you are breaking the law in a case like that. And that may also happen in cases where you think that you're keeping a promise, but let's say because you think that you're returning some money to a friend that you promised to return it to, but maybe the person that you're giving the money back to is not your friend, but someone cleverly disguised as your friend. So if you think of such norms, whether you're actually complying with them or violating them is not something that is transparent to the agent always. And in fact, in Knowledge and Its Limits, I argue that no non-trivial norms are transparent. So the non-transparency of knowledge norms is no argument against them. This is the argument that I give is what's what I call the anti-luminosity argument, and it's very closely related to some of the issues that I've been discussing in earlier lectures about the non-transitivity of indiscriminability, because that shows limits on our powers of discrimination, and those limits also limit our capacity to know whether we're complying with a norm or not. So in particular, it's a generalization of arguments in identity and discrimination and vagueness. My first two books about margins for error and the idea of safety. So the same kind of arguments also show that knowing does not imply being in a position to know that one knows. So there are circumstances in which, that you can, for example, know that you feel cold, but even though you're not in a position to know that you feel cold. And that's one of the cases where I differ from what the early Oxford realists thought. That's contrary to what Cook-Wilson thought, who thought that if for example, if you know that you feel cold, then that itself amounts to knowing that you know that you feel cold, which I deny. So when I published Knowledge and Its Limits, I expected it to be less successful than vagueness, because I felt that vagueness had been successful in part because it had a very kind of simple message, which is fundamentally that vagueness is a kind of ignorance, and that as where people knew where to locate the position that I advocated in vagueness, or where to locate epistemicism in a kind of map of the space of possible theories of vagueness. But when I published Knowledge and Its Limits, I was afraid that the position that I was advocating was too different from the kind of view that people were used to, that they wouldn't really know how to relate to it. And so I thought it was partly that the book was in some respects too technical, but more technical than most works of epistemology, at least involving more more logic than most of them do, and too unfamiliar in its approach, and too hard to classify to have such a large impact. And in fact, that's when I was worrying about that. That's when I came up with the slogan "knowledge first," because I wanted people to have a kind of simple, as we say, take-home message about the book that the book was arguing for, and so I thought knowledge first would do for that, and so I put it right at the beginning, I think, of the introduction, so that if people even just read the first sentence of the book, they would already get that message. And I mean, I thought that I wasn't very confident that would work, but I just wanted there to be some kind of possibility of getting, some initial grasp on what the book was arguing for. And in fact, I was quite wrong about its impact. I mean, it's because, to my surprise, it's easily my most frequently cited work. It's clearly my most influential book, and so I think people sort of did. I mean, they didn't, of course, always accept the knowledge first approach, but they did understand that was what the book was about, and so they kind of got this new approach to epistemology, and so that showed, I think, that epistemology was ready for something new. That people much more widely had become unsatisfied with the kind of traditional post-Gettier paradigm for how to do epistemology, and they felt that had not been going in a productive direction, and so I think that made them much more receptive to knowledge and its limits as a possible new way for epistemology to go. And I'll stop there. So thanks very much. I will stop sharing.
Okay, let's thank Professor Williamson for this very wonderful lecture. Okay, now it's time for us to introduce the interlocutor of this lecture, Ye Ru. Okay, Ye Ru joined Wuhan University as an associate researcher in 2016 after getting her PhD. Can I open my audio? Okay, it's okay. Okay, sorry.
Yes.
After getting her PhD from Cornell University, she works mainly on epistemology, more specifically higher-order evidence, permissivism, and epistemic value. Her recent work focuses on how to incorporate information about one's reliability or unreliability, how to cope with normative uncertainty, and how to understand the truth conduciveness of rationality. Okay, now it's time for Ye Ru to communicate with Professor Williamson. Okay, please.
Okay, thank you, Professor Williamson, for this wonderful talk. First, I must confess that I'm not a great fan of knowledge first epistemology, not because I have some serious objection against it, but because I'm a subjective Bayesian and the concept of knowledge doesn't seem to be very important to Bayesian epistemology. And although Bayesians do frequently use the concept of knowledge, but it seems that when they use the concept of knowledge, they often mean something like subjective certainty or something like evidence. And my impression is that most Bayesians treat the concept of evidence as primitive, So if anything, I might be an evidence-first epistemologist, and I accept knowledge first only to the extent that knowledge can be, or evidence can be identified with knowledge. That said, I do have some questions and worries about knowledge first epistemology, and I very appreciate this great opportunity to communicate with Williamson to help me better understand this theory. So let me cut to the chase. Let me see if I can share screen. Sorry. So can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
Great. As I understand it, knowledge first epistemology has two core claims. First, knowledge is a primitive property. It's not analyzable in terms of other epistemic properties such as justification and truth. Second, instead, we can use knowledge to theorize about those other epistemic properties or notions such as evidence, rationality or justification, norms of assertion or action, etc. I will ask some clarification questions about motivations for and implications of these two claims. So first, I want to ask a question about the claim that the connection between the claim that knowledge is a mental state and the claim that knowledge is unanalyzable. So about the motivation for claiming that knowledge is unanalyzable, I understand that the failure of Getty project is part of the motivation, but it seems that you also use the idea that knowledge is a mental state to motivate the unanalyzability of knowledge. Could you explain this later motivation in greater details? How exactly the mentality of knowing is supposed to support the unanalyzability of knowledge? I guess I'm thinking that being a mental state is quite compatible with the analyzability of knowledge. And second question, you offer a safety theory of knowledge, which says that knowledge is safe belief. Is this theory an analysis of knowledge? If so, is it in tension with the unanalyzability of knowledge? So that's my first batch of questions. My second batch of questions focus on the externalist implication of the claim that evidence can be identified with knowledge. So the claim that evidence is identical with knowledge implies an externalist theory of rationality. And one familiar worry about the externalist implication is this. If you are an externalist in the sense that a belief is rational only if it's supported by the things that you know, what can stop you from sliding into a radically externalist position, which says that a belief is rational only if it's true? A standard reply to this worry is that truth is a purely external condition because it's not a mental state. So it's not something we can directly respond to. Knowledge, on the other hand, is a mental state, as you have argued. We can respond to or be guided by knowledge. I think this move can prevent the slippery slope into radical externalism, but I wonder, can it prevent the slippery slope into another form of radical externalism, which says that a belief is rational only if it's likely to be true given some input states of your belief forming process, and that input state doesn't have to be a mental state. It might be a purely physical state of yours that doesn't even rise to the mental level. So my question is this: when it comes to rationality conferring power, what's the principal difference between knowledge, a mental state that's reliably connected to the world, and those purely physical states of yours that are also reliably connected to the world? Why is being mental so important, especially given that a mental state needs not be fully transparent, as you have argued? Okay, so that's my first question about the externalist implication of E is K. I have another question about the externalist implication of E is K. In order to explain away our internalist intuition that we normal people and our deceived counterpart are on a par with respect to rationality, you appeal to some other notions like reasonableness, manifesting good disposition, etc. I have no problem with assessing beliefs at multiple levels. My question is, which notion is the real important one? When we ask a question from a deliberative point of view, what should I believe? Why is being rational in your externalist sense of rationality a more important notion than being reasonable? I guess one way of answering this question is to see which notion is the relevant one when we try to hold a person morally responsible. But I don't think that when we hold a person morally responsible, the relevant epistemic condition that goes with responsibility is an externalist one. So that's my second question about the externalist implication of E is K. I have several other side questions. I will ask. It's not very related to the lectures today, but I'll ask them anyway because I'm curious. I'm just curious. So about my next question is about the connection between E is K and the concept of learning in Bayesian updating. If you think evidence is knowledge, does this commit you to the claim that all instances of learning, namely gaining new evidence, take the form of propositional learning? What do you say to those people who are sympathetic to the Jeffrey thought that sometimes gaining new information doesn't consist in earning a proposition, but in redistributing your subjective probability in a relevant partition? The next side question, where do you stand on the permissivism versus impermissivism of rationality? You seem to take evidential probability as unique in a lot of your discussion involving the rational reflection principle, in which all words in the model are equipped with the same prior probability. Is this merely assumed for convenience, or do you really take evidential probability as unique? A last side question. For a defender of knowledge-first epistemology, are there any new territories to be explored? We've seen what this epistemology says about evidence, justification, rational decision theory, norms of assertion and action, etc. What new work do you think can be done by knowledge-first epistemology? Okay, that's all of my questions. You can, Professor Williamson, you can select some and answer.
Right.
I've also, okay, yeah, that, sorry.
Yeah.
I'll stop.
Yes. So thank you very much for those good questions. I think I'll say a bit about my general relation to subjective Bayesianism first. So, I mean, I think the position that I'm offering in knowledge and its limits, I mean, it has quite a bit in common with Bayesianism because it has and uses much of the same probabilistic apparatus, but it's roughly speaking what I'm offering is a kind of objective Bayesianism, although not, as it were, a formal. I mean, not a reduction of Bayesianism to some kind of purely logically defined probabilities, and so the main way in which these two approaches differ is in terms of the evidence on which one updates. I mean, I'll say a little bit about Jeffrey conditionalization in a moment, but as I understand it, a purely subjective form of Bayesianism, which I think is the commonest form, is one on which when the Bayesian talks about evidence, they just mean, as it were, whatever propositions the agent does in fact update on, with no normative constraints on what those propositions are. And so in that form of subjective Bayesianism it is one on which it's a kind of theory of rationality, but a theory which really just provides, as it were, conditions of internal coherence, so that, as it were, that the rationality requires adhering to the axioms of probability. I mean, the Kolmogorov axioms, and also only updating by conditionalization. I mean, in the most usual form, just by, I mean, standard conditionalization, but that could be liberalized to Jeffrey conditionalization. And my main objection to that kind of approach is that it radically impoverishes epistemology, because there are all sorts of epistemologically highly objectionable views which still satisfy these constraints of rationality. So that, for example, somebody who's totally, let's say, totally deluded about the vaccines for COVID-19, and has some kind of crazy conspiracy theory, that need not involve any violation of the standard probability axioms, and all their updating may be updating by just standard conditionalization. They may be updating by conditionalization, on propositions, such as the vaccines can alter your DNA, or whatever crazy view they happen to have, and so that seems to me that there is epistemology has to say something about why such views are epistemically bad, even though they don't involve any violation of Bayesian probabilistic coherence. And I think the most natural way of saying that is by having some independent constraint on evidence. So that it's not just okay to conditionalize on whatever you feel like, but the evidence that you conditionalize on has to have some independent status, and so in my case that's achieved by requiring that you update on evidence. Which, in the sense of, of knowledge, and so of course the trouble with Jeffrey conditionalization, since you ask about that, is that that there isn't any sort of natural way of constraining Jeffrey conditionalization in the same way as you can by constraining ordinary conditionalization by requiring that it be a conditionalization on what because Jeffrey conditionalization isn't determined by a set of propositional inputs in the same way. So that's why I think that we need something more than as it were classic forms of subjective Bayesianism. Now, I will I'll try to. I hope I'll be briefly able to answer the other questions, going back to the earlier parts of your talk. So the one question you asked was, does it follow from something being a mental state that it's unanalyzable? And actually, I agree with you that I don't think it does follow. And so the unanalyzability of knowledge, that's not achieved simply by insisting that knowledge is a mental state. I think it's achieved partly through the failures of attempts to analyze knowledge, and also by seeing as it were the very fundamental role of knowledge, so that as it were there's nothing, there are no other mental states that it would make sense to analyze knowledge in terms of, and on the and then I think your second question was, well, aren't I offering an analysis of knowledge as safe belief, and so kind of violating, as it were, my own principles? And what I want to say there is that fundamentally there's no way of, as it were, calibrating the appropriate level of safety except in terms of knowledge. So safety isn't something that can ultimately be fully understood independently of knowledge. So this is a bit like, the kind of thing that David Lewis says when he's talking about his semantics for counterfactuals, where he gives the semantics is given in terms of similarity, but he kind of says, but in the end you can't really understand what the right notion of similarity is except by between worlds, except by looking at counterfactuals themselves. So I think that so you might ask, well, then what's the point of saying that knowledge is safe belief if that doesn't work as an analysis? But I think the point of it is similar to the point of Lewis's analysis of counterfactuals in terms of similarity, which is that although in a way there's a kind of circularity in it, because the similarity is itself understood in terms of counterfactuals. That nevertheless you get some structural information from the analysis. And I think in the same way, you get some kind of structural information about knowledge by seeing it as safe belief, even though that's not really a non-circular analysis of knowledge. So I think the next question that you had was about whether I'm going for the extreme view that that only the only rational beliefs are true beliefs. And so in a way I am going for that extremely strong version of externalism about rational belief, because I think, although this wasn't something that was fully developed in Knowledge and Its Limits, but it's something that I've certainly argued for in my later papers, that ultimately the only beliefs that stand in appropriate relation to one's evidence are those which constitute knowledge, and therefore, of course, since if they constitute knowledge, they have to be true. So as it were, all knowledgeable beliefs will be rational, and only knowledgeable beliefs will be rational. So it's not that all true beliefs are rational, but only the ones that constitute knowledge. But then, I think that when we're thinking about rationality, something that is a lot of the literature doesn't really control for properly is that, we talk about rational beliefs, but we also talk about rational agents. And presumably a rational agent is to be understood as an agent who with a disposition to form rational beliefs. And so roughly speaking, that in my terms, that will be a rational agent is an agent with a disposition to form knowledge. But of course, dispositions can be inhibited so that you can still have a rational agent, in a skeptical scenario, because they have good cognitive dispositions, but they're just in unfortunate circumstances where those dispositions are sort of prevented from operating by or from achieving, from manifesting properly by the unfortunate circumstances. But then I think that there's a secondary notion of a rational belief, which is the kind of belief that a rational agent would have in those circumstances. And I think what you can see in the literature is a failure to distinguish between the original notion of rational belief as belief properly grounded in evidence, and the secondary notion of the kind of the belief that a rational agent would have in those circumstances. And those two notions of rational belief they're not equivalent to each other, because in a skeptical scenario, if we're talking about a rational agent who's been put in a skeptical scenario, then their beliefs will, roughly speaking, be rational beliefs in the secondary sense, because they're the beliefs that a rational agent would form in those circumstances. For example, the belief that they have hands, but they're not rational beliefs in the primary sense, that they're not in fact properly grounded in evidence, because they don't constitute knowledge. And so I think we have to, as it were, separate out these different notions of what it is for a belief to be rational that I think are generally kind of conflated in the literature. And so I'm in the primary sense of rational belief as a belief grounded on evidence, then I'm going for this hardline externalist account on which only knowledge counts as rational belief. But in the secondary sense of beliefs that a rational agent would have in the circumstances, then I'm going for the account in terms of dispositions, and then false beliefs can be rational in that secondary sense, but not in the primary sense. And in terms of the uniqueness, sorry, I'll say something about that afterwards. Yeah, and then I think yes, and then you were asking, well, what about the is as it were, can we really hold agents to, when we're judging moral responsibility, to externalist norms? And my response to that is that externalist norms are the only norms that there are, in the sense that the only non-trivial norms are ones such that the agent is not always in a position to know whether they're complying with them or not. I mean, that's the anti-luminosity argument, which of course you might disagree with, but so that when we're judging responsibility, moral responsibility in terms of compliance with norms, then the only relevant norms will be externalist ones. So that as well, there isn't really any room for anything else. So very, very briefly, on the uniqueness of evidential probability, I'm inclined. I mean, I'm inclined to think that these probabilistic notions that there's an element of model building about them. That talking in terms of probability is, it's a very helpful way of disciplining our thinking about many of these questions. And so, I'm very happy to think in these probabilistic terms. But I think that ultimately there's something a bit artificial about it that doesn't capture all the distinctions that we're really interested in. And I think one way in which that one can see that is that, for example, probability 1 is not the same thing as genuine certainty, because because for mathematical reasons in infinite probability distributions, many propositions which are not guaranteed to be true have to be assigned probability 1, and in fact and correspondingly, propositions which may be true have to be assigned probability 0s. And in fact, in many such situations, it's guaranteed that that there will be some true propositions with probability 0. And so, the distinctions that one can make in terms of the probability distribution they don't exactly map onto what we're really interested in capturing epistemologically, and so in that sense, there may be something artificial going on here. Exactly how to think about it, I think it's not very clear, but that's a kind of at least a partial response. And then when you were asking about new areas for the knowledge first approach. So one new area that I'm interested in is how to integrate the knowledge first approach with the work I did with Jason Stanley about knowing how, understood as propositional knowledge, which I mean it's perfectly compatible with the knowledge first approach, but I want to integrate them more closely, and also integrate them with some thinking I've been doing about the nature of desire and practical reasoning, and so provide a more fully sort of integrated account of how the role of knowing how in practical reasoning can be fitted into the knowledge first approach. So that's one area. I mean, I know that. I mean, for example, Mona Simeon in Glasgow is doing a lot of interesting work now on doing social epistemology in a kind of knowledge first way. And partly theoretical, but I think also with practical applications about, for example, what kind of norms for journalism are needed, because there are practical problems with the. I mean, many journalists are taught that what they need to achieve is balance, but then that is kind of applied in some really damaging ways, where for example, if they have a discussion of anti-vaxxing, that they'll have scientific experts, and then to balance them they'll have some some crazy conspiracy theorists who are all, and they think that balancing, always requires people on both sides, even when there's a completely decisive scientific case on one side or the other. And I think that she's got some proposals about how to use knowledge norms to achieve better norms for journalism. So that's an example of the way in which the approach actually has some practical application. And I mean, there are other things I could mention, but I think it would be sensible for me to stop there and give people time to ask their questions. So thanks very much again for those good questions you were asking.
Can I just have a very brief follow-up on the radical externalism question?
Yes.
So I misspoke about the definition of radical externalism. By radical externalism, I don't mean the view that a belief is rational only if it's true. That I don't think is very radical.
Yes.
Rather, I mean the view that a belief is rational if it's true. So being true is
I'm not. So, yeah, I think all the norms that I'm going for are knowledge norms, and so and I regard a norm on which truth is sufficient for belief, for a rational belief, as a I don't accept that because on my many rational beliefs are very many true beliefs are very improbable given the agent's evidence, and so there's really nothing to be said for them, and I think that can that kind of conception of evidence is grounded in some sort of basically functional way of thinking about cognitive agents. So I don't think there's a danger of sliding into that kind of the kind of externalism where truth is sufficient for rationality in a belief. And of course, if all you had was externalism, you might not be able to give a reason for not going that way. But given that externalism is only one aspect of the knowledge first approach, I think that I'm in a fairly comfortable position in rejecting what we both agree is a kind of crazily extreme form of externalism about rationality.
Yes. So I understand that I agree with that. You can resist the slippery slope into that radical externalism. And my question is, can you block another form of radical externalism, which says your evidence? So evidence is the thing we're supposed to respond to, and as you just said, the idea that truth is sufficient for rationality is just crazy, because when something is true but you just have no evidence for it, then we shouldn't say it's rational for you to believe it, because you cannot just respond to the truth itself without any evidence. But my question is why we should restrict evidence to those mental states that are reliably connected to the world. So, for example, imagine the client voice case in the classical objection against brute reliabilism. So, suppose that person is responding to some purely physical stimulation of his belief. Just some purely physical stimulation, and that purely physical stimulation doesn't rise to the mental level. So, yeah, my question is why does being mental so important? So why we shouldn't respond to those physical states that are reliably connected to the world for rationality?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know how much this as it were, maybe this is just kind of repeating my view, but if we have a, well, I mean, the person forms a belief, even in the bonjour cases, and you know, if the belief doesn't, if the belief constitutes knowledge, then of course it will be rational, and you know, and there might be some versions of the bonjour case, I mean, which bonjour rather under-describes, in fact, but there might be, in some versions of the bonjour case, we might simply be dealing with knowledge, and just some, as it were, you know, fairly, you know, some primitive form of knowledge, and then if we are dealing with that, then it's rational. But if it's not, if the connection to the fact isn't sufficient for knowledge, then you know that means that the person doesn't have proper access to that fact, and it's not really whether it's a mental state or not. It's simply that the relevant notion of as it were access to the facts, which we could also call evidence. I think the natural notion of having access to the facts is just that by knowledge, and so if you know, if you have some physical connection, which but it isn't access, then the person's you know, belief will true. I mean, the true belief, you know, will be caused in some way, but it's not as it were a cognitively appropriate one, and so it's not rational. But I agree that, as it were, the issue, you know, it's not that whether a belief is rational depends on it doesn't have to depend on its relation to other mental states. It may just be, I mean, the belief itself, of course, is a mental state, and if it's knowledge, then it's a rational mental state. But,
okay, I guess I'll just have a different notion of access. So I'm thinking maybe when somebody's sort of connection to some physical state can be counted as access, even if it doesn't rise to the level of knowledge. Yeah. Okay. I understand your response. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Okay. Thank Professor Williamson's nice replies and explanations. Okay. For all audience, you are welcome to post your question in the chat box. Okay, please. Okay. And also, we have two questions from our faculty here. The first one is from Xu Zhaoqing, and he has read your book. So, Xu Zhaoqing, I see you have opened your video. So, you would like to directly communicate with Professor Williamson? Okay.
Yeah, yes. Hi, Kim.
Hi.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I just have two questions. The first one is, you said that belief can be viewed as some kind of both knowledge in your book, but there you say that not interpreting belief as knowledge matters. So I'm wondering, how would you explain belief in terms of knowledge, except just use knowledge as norms for belief? This is my first question. Yes. And the second one is, when we distinguish between internalism and externalism, we use the anything not internal is external. But when you use the premise arguments in chapter 3 of your book, the knowledge and its limits, to argue against that the broad condition is a conjunction of the internal condition and the environment condition. You define the environment condition independently, rather than as any condition that is not internal is environmental. So I'm wondering, isn't that a little bit unfair to the internalists, since they might just say that the broad conditions is a conjunction of internal condition and external condition. So that's my second question. Thank you.
Right. So first of all, in relation to your first question about explaining belief in terms of knowledge, the kind of account that I defend is basically, this is rather briefly in Knowledge and Its Limits, is one on which a belief is a state that, as it were, in some local ways behaves like knowledge. So that, as it were, you're treating a proposition, in some local ways as you would if you knew it. So in particular, when I say local, I just mean, as it were, just, for example, just in practical reasoning. So just as knowledge can give you the premises for practical reasoning, a belief can, and so you can act on your beliefs in the same way as you act on your knowledge, and so in those respects, the belief is like knowledge. But of course, the belief may have been formed in some different way, which is not knowledge-like, and so whether it's the similarity is just local to practical reasoning rather than a kind of global similarity in terms of all its causes and effects. So that's the basic sort of picture, which is, it's a bit it's not super precise, but that's the idea. In relation to your second question, so I defined the environmental condition as kind of symmetrical within the internal conditions. So the internal conditions are purely internal, and environmental conditions are purely environmental. So I think if we said that if we just looked at broad conditions as conjunctions of internal conditions and external conditions, if external conditions were any non-internal conditions, then any condition whatsoever would be either internal or non-internal. So we wouldn't, external in that sense. So that so we wouldn't really need to take conjunctions. But I mean, the reason that I was considering, conjunctions of environmental and internal conditions, this more restrictive notion, is because I think that is often how you actually see people arguing, that they're thinking that you could actually, as a factor, these broad conditions into purely internal and purely external components. And I wanted to show that was a more restrictive approach than it sounds, and that the kinds of explanations that they're offering, which also try to involve this kind of factorization, are more restrictive. And so, I agree that those are not the only possible approaches to consider. So I don't take the primeness argument by itself to be a argument against sort of analyses of knowledge or anything like that. But I think that this kind of making the division in the way that I did, it's actually helpful for understanding what's going on in quite a few sort of internalist approaches, but I mean, because they're thinking that they can make a kind of clean separation between the contribution of the mind and the contribution of the environment. And my point is just that a lot of explanatorily important conditions just don't admit the kind of clean separation that they have in mind. So that's why I did things in the way that I did. But I agree that, you know, and this is a point that I make in Knowledge and Its Limits, that there are other forms of analysis as well that have to be considered. But it just in practice, you often find internalists looking at, thinking in terms of conjunctions of internal and environmental conditions.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And there's another question from Davi. Okay, this question is, I would be curious to know what Professor Williamson thinks about non-standard analysis of knowledge, which you don't appear to believe. For instance, analysis of knowledge in terms of abilities, such as Hammond's analysis in terms of the ability to be guided by the facts. These analyses are also underexplored. That it seems a bit premature to judge their research program as degenerating. Okay.
Yeah. So there is actually a discussion of Hyman's approach in Knowledge and Its Limits, where I argue that it doesn't. It's in a way a kind of disunified, because this the way he sets things up, there are many different ways in which you can be guided by the facts, and what seems to underlie them all is that you know, and so I just there I argue that that he gets the explanatory, the order of explanation, that they're basically the wrong way around, and then we've had some further exchanges. There's a symposium on his recent book in Philosophy and Phenomenological Research, where I make some criticisms and he's got a response, so that you can have a look at that, and so of course, I mean, you're right that that there are all sorts of non-standard ways in which people might try to analyze knowledge, not in terms of belief, but in terms of something else, and so it's difficult to make you could say that's an unexplored space. So if we're thinking in terms of analysis as something like conceptual analysis, I think that it's these approaches are extremely unlikely to work, because it's kind of, it's certainly would be crazy to think of, for example, of children who can say things like, I don't know where my toy is, that what they're saying is really to be understood as, I don't have the ability to be guided by the fact as to where my toy is, or something like that. So I think at the level, of so-called conceptual analysis, I think that there aren't many options, because in fact it's the children acquire the distinction between knowing and not knowing at such an early stage. And by the way, also some non-human animals seem to have this distinction in some form. So I think there are really very few options there to consider. I mean, of course, there is also the idea that knowledge, is to be analyzed in terms of some other things at the metaphysical level. So it's not in terms of how we understand knowledge, but just of what knowledge is. And there, of course, the considerations about what the order of understanding in human beings and maybe other animals is less relevant. But I also, I don't see anything very promising there. I mean, of course, physicalists will think that ultimately there's some reduction of knowledge to the physical, and I don't say anything, against. I mean, that would all be consistent with the knowledge first approach, because it wouldn't make any difference at the epistemological level or even at the level of philosophy of mind. But I also, I think just at, even metaphysically, when one thinks about the nature of mind and what functionally what a mind is for, I think it's pretty basic that a mind is for, as it were, the function of a mind is to enable the minded creature to adjust its behavior, in a complex and changing environment, on the basis of knowledge, or if one likes information, but it doesn't. That doesn't make much difference, and so that, as it were, acting on what one knows is absolutely central to intelligent life. So although one could spend one's time looking for non-standard analyses, it seems to me an extremely unpromising research program for the kind of reasons that I've explained.
Okay. It says I didn't see any new question. Okay, I have a question in mind. You claim that the word knowledge cannot be analyzed as belief plus some factors, such as justified true belief. I didn't read your book, but I believe that in your book you have many arguments for your thesis. So my question is that for you, do you think that is there any forceful competing argument against your thesis?
You mean a forceful argument that knowledge must be analyzed in some way? Is that what you mean?
The argument against against my
thesis of analyzing the ability. Not really, because I think that I think the idea that that must be such an analysis is very closely connected with kind of internalist views, and and in particular, I think that if people are internalist about the mind, then knowledge, then it will look very compelling that there has to be an analysis of knowledge in more basic terms, because knowledge isn't a mental state, and it really just looks like some kind of mixture of mental states and other stuff, and so if you accepted an internalist view about the mind, then on that basis there would be quite a strong argument to expect an analysis of knowledge. But of course, I've been mentioning that there are lots of independent arguments against internalism about mental states, and so if one has an externalist view, I don't think that there are there are any special reasons to expect this kind of analysis, and I think in general, philosophers have been too focused on analysis as a philosophical project, and I think, well, as it were, a point that I make in Knowledge and Its Limits is that in some cases, as it were, the drive for analysis comes from specific research programs in philosophy. So, for example, the one I mention is Russell's what he calls the principle of acquaintance. That every proposition that we can understand must be analyzable into terms all of which we're acquainted with. And then, Russell has some very strong conditions on acquaintance, so that as well you could only be acquainted with things where you have which are completely cognitively transparent to you, and then and if you have a program like that, then you'll also expect knowledge to be analyzable, because knowledge isn't something that's just completely transparent to us. But of course, Russell's program, which comes from some kind of empiricism or something, it's not something that any longer seems at all compelling to most philosophers. And I think, as we're, to put it crudely, as philosophers have got into the habit of trying to analyze things and provide necessary and sufficient conditions for things, and I don't think that in general that is a particularly promising research strategy. I don't think that that in the natural sciences, scientists are constantly looking for necessary and sufficient conditions. Their theoretical work takes up forms which have turned out to be more fruitful, and so my own feeling is we should kind of give up this habit of always looking for analyses and try and look for forms of theorizing that are actually more productive. There aren't really any general kind of arguments that knowledge must be analyzable that really worry me. Of course, if somebody produces a particular analysis of knowledge, in more basic, or supposedly more basic terms or independent terms, so then you if you want, there is a task of finding out what are the counterexamples to those that particular analysis. But of course, the mere fact that you don't immediately think of a counterexample isn't a strong argument in favor of the analysis. And I think we have very strong inductive evidence to expect either that there will be counterexamples, or that if not, it will be because there are some terms in the analysis which are implicitly being understood in terms of knowledge itself, so that it's in fact circular.
Okay. Just one way.
Maybe just very quick follow up on Professor Williamson's comment on Jeffrey updating. I guess I think so. Jeffrey updating. Yeah, I agree that it should be supplemented by some explanation about how the relevant partition is determined and how the rational distribution on the partition is determined. But I take it the basic idea, or the most fundamental idea of Jeffrey updating, is that sometimes learning or gaining new evidence doesn't come in the form of learning a new proposition or come to knowing a proposition. So his classic example is when imagine that you are initially in a completely dark room, and you have a piece of cloth, and so since the room is completely dark, you have no idea what the color of the cloth is. But then after some time, the room is illuminated by some dim light. But since the light is dim, you also don't learn the color of the cloth. But definitely something have happened to your mind, and you seem to have gained some evidence, and so some updating, some kind of updating is required, and it just seems difficult to model that updating in terms of conditionalizing your prior on some new knowledge you have gained.
Well. So let's assume that it's correct. I mean that you have in that situation. Let's say you have not come to know that that the cloth is green. You haven't come to know that it's red, and so on. But there are lots of propositions that you have learned. I mean, you've learned that. And not simply that you've learned that the light conditions have changed, but you've also learned, maybe that the cloth looks greenish or something like that, and maybe there are some, that maybe there's some more specific shade of green that we don't have a special word for, but you've learned that it looks that shade of green, and so on. And so, I think that there are plenty of of things that one has learned in a situation like that, and so I think part of what's going on here is just that in perception we get a lot of fine-grained information. Even in situations where the lighting conditions are very good, and so on, we're getting fine-grained information about the shapes, the colors, the relative positions of objects, and all that kind of thing, and our ability to articulate all of that in words is very limited, and it seems clear that we've gained more information than we can simply state, in words of our native language or whatever, and so that I think we have to allow that the relevant propositions, may be ones that we don't have any very good way of articulating in purely verbal form, and so I think that is an important feature of cognition, that we're trying to put everything into words often seems to be losing something, but I don't think that I don't think that particularly motivates Jeffrey conditionalization in the on reflection, because after all, Jeffrey conditionalization itself is an operation on the same sort of probability space as ordinary conditionalization, whatever that probability space is. And I think that the lessons to be learned are more about the relation between the underlying probability space on which we're operating and our ability to articulate propositions within it, in a particular form. I think once we've got a more adequate way of handling that, which of course I have not fully provided or anything, I don't think anybody has any very decisive ideas about how to do that, then I think that itself should be what handles the kind of situation that Jeffrey is talking about, rather than a different kind of updating.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I'm done.
Okay. We have run out of time. Okay, now it's time to say goodbye. Okay, thank you, Professor Williamson, for this very wonderful lecture. Also, thank the interlocutor. Thank all for attending this lecture. Also, let's look forward to Williamson's next lecture and on next Saturday. Okay, bye-bye. Okay, bye-bye.